Alrighty, welcome to the first iteration of Thinky in the Brain. I am your host, John Echeverria. I am a history major at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. This is a podcast revolving around two people discussing a singular topic. A feature that kind of separates us from other podcasts is that one member of the conversation is going to be somebody who's extremely knowledgeable about the subject, and the other person probably has minimal to no experience with the topic. The premise of this topic, or of this podcast, I should say, is to make subject matters more accessible for the everyday audience, but still with an underlying foundation in scholarly knowledge and academia. With me today is special guest Dennis Jose Lee Lopez. He is a recent graduate of Mount St. Mary's College in Frederick County, Maryland. Dennis graduated in 2017 with high honors, earning a bachelor's degree in the science of accounting, and works as an accounting consultant for a firm based in his hometown. He is currently studying for the CPA exam and is expecting to take it within the next year. He is my best friend and mentor, and this extremely intelligent man probably knows little to nothing about the topic we're going to talk about today. And I am your host, John Echeverria. I am a history major at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And so that leads me into my next question, Jose. What do you know about drugs in Vietnam?
Well, very little, and thank you again for that wonderful introduction.
Of course.
As you said, I studied accounting, and whatever little background I have in history is whatever general education courses were available.
Do you like history?
I enjoy it to an extent. I mean, in accounting, we use historical evidence to support future planning. So, in a way, yeah.
Well, all right. Hopefully, you're kind of interested in the topic today. I know it's not your field of expertise, but it's kind of an experience, I guess, something to learn. Basically, we're going to start off with how I'm going to structure this podcast. I'm kind of going to go in the direction of naming the types of drugs used and kind of their historical properties. There's going to be about 6 groupings that I use. One's going to be dedicated to like opium. The second one's marijuana. Some other lesser known drugs are going to be discussed during this topic. I know some of the bigger ones like marijuana or opium or heroin always get a lot of spotlight when you talk about the Vietnam War. There was definitely some smaller known drugs or chemical substances that people use, definitely. And so depending on time allowance and how interested I keep you, we'll just go from there. So next thing I want to go into is my limiting factors. Of course, this is all a research-based project. And so with that, I'm kind of limited in a few different areas. The first one is that the accessibility to resources is kind of difficult. Of course, there's going to be, especially with the Vietnam War, and trying to uncover, especially like North Vietnamese documents and South Vietnamese, since the reunification of Vietnam, there's going to be legal barriers and language issues. I personally don't know Vietnamese. I wish I could, because then I could probably know a lot more about the historical significance of this topic, but I don't, unfortunately. Time constraint. This, as you know, is a school project, and so I don't have all the time in the world. I can't spend a decade researching it and publishing my research. And the last part of it, and I think this goes to show with any historical project or research, is that it's a historical event. So data, documents, any kind of information has the possibility of being unrecorded, lost, or destroyed in any attempt when you try to uncover. You may figure out that there just isn't there because people got rid of it.
Makes sense, especially in a time of strife.
Of course, yeah. So the first drug I want to talk about is opium. Opium is seen in Vietnam much earlier than the Vietnam War. You see it in the French Indochina conflict, and you see it a little bit before that. It kind of held some sort of economic and social foundations. When you look at most of the regions in North Vietnam, there was a trade system that was going on in the Indochina region. The actual introduction of opium in this region is kind of shrouded in mystery. That's what I found out when researching.
Right. My only question to that would be, was it a possibility? Because I know possibly in China, I think it was British introduced, if I'm wrong.
Yes,
Um,
yes. So the Opium Wars, I think you're referring to. Um, there's some plausibility in that theory because France did obtain Vietnam and the surrounding countries like Cambodia and Laos in the mid to late 19th century, and they also supported Britain, if I'm correct. And so that's a potential theory that it was introduced by the French. Other theories come into play when I think the documentation that I was looking at from the UN Office on Drugs and Crimes notes that there's a few actual local legends that attribute it to Chinese introducing into the neighboring regions and not the French.
okay,
Although the French did continue the trade, it's not like they stopped the trade of opium once
right.
they garnered control of those regions. So one of the local legends is that it was introduced in the 18th or 19th century. But even with these theories, these local legends, the UN office kind of gives warnings to believing these theories or these legends because even though it's plausible, they say that you should take caution before jumping to such a conclusion without submitting this hypothesis to the test of other historical data, which kind of goes back into the constraints that I was talking about.
Gotcha.
After decades of research, you might figure out, since it is a local legend or just a theory, you might not find anything. But
So essentially, at this point, the use of opium has already been encultured within Vietnam before the war.
yes,
All right.
so before the second Indochina conflict, which is known to us as the Vietnam War, opium was already established as something that you was a part of trade.
Gotcha.
A lot of actually French infrastructure was built using selling and trading opium, and it's kind of referenced also in certain political figures. Ho Chi Minh in 1954, I believe, referenced the use of opium, or actually, I guess, listed grievances. Yes, September 3rd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh lists grievances, and he lists opium as one of those kind of aspects of undermining the Vietnamese, getting them hooked on opium or getting them hooked on alcohol.
More like what you meant to use that, especially as sort of a, I wouldn't say a rally cry, but whenever we have some sort of revolutionary leader to point out those social and
Yeah, he's basically pointing out the social injustices.
right.
But yeah, he goes along with saying that colonialism in general, but specifically targeting the French. And so after that, in the same report that I was discussing earlier, the UN report, they described the historical significance of opium and its illegal markets, and that the French actually circumvented the local population's attempt to illegally distribute it and to put it within their own regulated markets, their government markets, because when you smuggled it into the lower regions, like Tonkin and Annam, it
Right.
came competition to the French monopoly of opium trade.
Which I imagine produced quite a bit of profit.
Yes, yes, it did. So when you discuss the opium and opiates during the Vietnam War, it's kind of easy to obtain a lot of a very wide range of in-era documents, and not just from the Vietnam War, but before, that details opiate use. And that kind of includes, I'm going to include heroin as an opiate. And so in one case study conducted by Lee Robbins, which he did in 1970, he noted that fewer than half of this random sample of veterans that he obtained, it was 450 men, 43% of them reported opiate use in the year, in 1970, and that 38% of the people who used opium, or actually 38% of that 43%, so the less than half, there was 38% who used opium and 34% who used heroin, and then the other percentage was used some other kind of opiate.
That's quite a significant number.
It is, and when looking this up, I was trying to find, in the hours that I took to find drugs, and specifically heroin and opiates. And so when I was looking at the Texas University, I think it's Texas Tech University Vietnam Center and Archive, which is a great resource if you use the virtual Vietnam archive. Luckily, I didn't have to go to Texas to find these documents. you find that in one of their documents, and it was the one that was where information was collected from 1954 to 1965, so before the Tet offensive. You see that they've already listed basically the same thing that the UN document has listed, that opium is produced in the mountainous regions of the provinces bordering China and Laos, so kind of the northern parts, and that it's raised by an ethnic minority of Vietnamese, and that it's a government-controlled crop. So you don't really see, what I was finding was that you don't really see a lot of usage until post 1968, and that's when a lot of these studies start occurring. The first one that I would have talked about was the one done by Lee Robbins, which even though he documented in 1971, it was taken in 1970, a year prior.
All right, so one question for that is,
Sure.
The number of, I guess, U.S. soldiers that reported use of the opiates was pretty high. Did some sort of stigma occur within or during the Vietnam conflict, where because they were, I guess, using the opiates as sort of negative towards soldiers, added to?
When looking at heroin, the numbers are definitely inflated, and there are some authors out there who have written that, and this will all be listed underneath in my sources, that the Vietnam War was kind of fought by a group of men that were always constantly high. And it's not very true. I would say, and the author I'm specifically referring to is John Steinbeck. And although he was specifically talking to certain drugs like marijuana, I think it's still representative of a lot of the drug use, where people kind of, I'd say they definitely stigmatize soldiers as being, constantly high or stoned. I'd also like to make the distinction that, trying or experimenting with drugs isn't really the same as using them consistently or as an addict. So I think Steinbeck kind of maybe mixes the two. I think one of his quotes is that he says he estimated that 75% of soldiers in Vietnam got high regularly. And that is, looking at Lee Robbins' case study, it's not really anywhere close, at least with the random survey sample that he took. 75% doesn't equal 43% or 48%. But it's still relatively, it's kind of a high number for opiate usage.
Right.
So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah.
I think when you look, or some of the other quotes from Lee Robbins, Lee Robbins was saying that practically every man had an opportunity to use heroin in Vietnam. And some of these numbers are kind of synonymous with what Steinbeck is saying. Not necessarily the fact that 75% of soldiers got high, but the fact that the introduction to heroin or the opportunity to use heroin was very high. 85% of men told Lee Robbins that they had been offered heroin, and some of them during their arrival. So once they're getting off either the plane or whatever transport vehicle, they were offered heroin in exchange of clean urine so that they could pass a urine testing, a screening. From the end of his study, I guess, 35% of the Army or Army enlisted men tried heroin. If 85% are offered, only 35% actually tried heroin, and only 19% became addicted to it.
Yeah.
So I think when you look at opium and opiates and marijuana, it's very common during the war, but it's not necessarily as common as people like to believe it is. How potentially, whether it's, pop culture or the memory of people that were in country at the time, it might not have been necessarily as, I want to say chaotic.
Right, like immoral. Sort of war with no effective boundary.
I think, a lot of the reasons that soldiers used drugs in the Vietnam War and basically any other war was that it's a stressful combat situation. There's a need for self-medication, some kind of escape.
Right.
Just talking to the soldiers and what they reported of how many people were offered drugs is extremely, A, it was extremely low cost, and B, it's readily available.
Right. So it's mostly a product of the environment, not a product of soldiers gone rogue, essentially.
Yeah, I could definitely agree with that statement. And so next I want to talk about is marijuana. I think that's the biggest one that they, when you think of Vietnam or you think of the late 60s, early 70s, everybody loves to talk about marijuana. So this is where I'm going to take kind of a divergent. I'm not really going to focus too much about marijuana, only because I think it's been done a lot. And if you'd like to search that information, there's probably a host of resources that can help you out. But there's a good reason that it's so talked about. It was the most commonly used illicit drug in Vietnam. Looking at certain documents, like one article I found, part of strategy, but I will consider it strategy, was to destroy the growing fields. So marijuana fields, mostly South Vietnam, because that's where soldiers were concentrated, was in the south. Right. But in one article that what I discovered was that in one Viet Cong bunker that U.S. troops had discovered, they found 200 pounds of marijuana. At that time, the estimated cost was about $100,000, and most likely that wasn't the only bunker that they found. This was a tactic that they used because North Vietnamese did use, same with the opium trade, it was something that funded the government or funded their system. You need money to continue a war, especially if you're going to fight a very prolonged war. And
pardon me for interrupting. Quick question.
Sure.
So, the Ho Chi Minh was against it as part of his grievances, but was it still part of his funding?
So this is where the distinction comes in, because I guess against a lot of people's belief, Ho Chi Minh wasn't really involved too much in the Vietnam War. He was more of a figurehead, kind of an idol. He was still alive at the time, but I would definitely recommend, if you're looking to read more about that claim that Ho Chi Minh isn't really part of the Vietnam War, there's a book called Hanoi's War, and it goes into kind of the internal conflict that's occurring with the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and like the Viet Cong by our terms. And you see that there's a lot more figures that are at the helm of the North Vietnamese front. And they weren't too worried about drug sales or illegal drug trade. They were worried about what they wanted, which was independence and their own kind of self-rule with no Western influence whatsoever.
So Ho Chi Minh was sort of the symbol of their ideals.
Yes. So he was, in the Indochina or the French Indochina conflict or war, he was definitely a big part of it. When you come to Vietnam, not so much. I think it's kind of a skew of American history to think that Ho Chi Minh was a continuous leader throughout both wars. But yeah, that's why I would say, even though you could probably argue if he was, it would seem a little bit backwards to claim that opium and alcohol are bad, but marijuana's okay.
Right.
Fortunately, I guess he wasn't part of the newer generation of fighters and the war effort. And so marijuana, I guess, basically, like I said before, largest used drug in Vietnam. So top of that, I would say regarding marijuana, it's definitely used a lot more. In the same, I guess, data presented by Lee Robbins, he states that marijuana was probably one of the only, not say bigger, but more regular used drug in the Vietnam War. It made up about 30%.
All right.
So definitely a big one, but I don't really want to focus about that right now. I want to find something smaller, something maybe more nuanced. And that's where I switch over to Rosa Canina. It's a plant. It's kind of like cannabis, I'd say. Nobody knows it, or from what I know, there's not a really lot of documentation. There is some, and most of where I get my documentation is actually from a semi-fictional account of somebody who fought for the North Vietnamese. And so when you look up this flower, it's considered similar to dogwood flower, and if I don't know if you've ever seen that, it's not a lily, but it's kind of pretty.
All right.
It's a dogwood's like a white, almost looks like a vanilla flower, like a vanilla bean flower. It's like got that very, at least the dogwood is very white. The rosa is pink.
So beautiful flower, deceptively dangerous.
Kind of, yeah. It has a pinkish hue and it's extremely fragrant. And it's able to grow in Europe, North Africa, and Southwest Asia. It's actually directly referred to in Tsar of War.
Is it native to Vietnam? Or is it one of those that was possibly introduced?
I'm not sure. That would be a great thing to look into. I want to say that since it is able to grow in just 3 different, that it must have been introduced somehow. But like I said, not sure. Its usage is noted in this book, Tsar of War, and it's written by Bao Nin, and he kind of refers to it in several passages. One quote that I'm going to read from the book, he talks about how between the jungle and the forest along this stream, Rosa Canina blossomed in the rain, whitening everywhere, its perfume filling the air, especially at night. Those diabolical flowers. Kien had seen them in the jungles along the western ridge of the mountains and even deep inside Cambodia around Taret, but nowhere did they grow the way they did here, with such a powerful scent. Later it was Kien's scout platoon taking a break in some idle moments who decided to try drying the canina, slicing the flowers and roots, and then mixing them with tobacco as a smoke. After just a few puffs, they felt themselves lifted, quietly floating like a wisp of smoke, itself floating on the wind. The tasty canina had many wondrous attributes. They could decide what they'd like to dream about, or even blend the dreams, like preparing a wonderful cocktail. With canina, one smoked to forget the daily hell of the soldier's life, smoked to forget hunger and suffering, also to forget death, and totally to forget tomorrow. The local people say canina thrives in graveyards, or any area carrying the scent of death. It's a blood-loving flower.
Beautiful language.
He's definitely very, very artistic with how he writes about it, and it's probably one of the bigger sources that I was able to obtain about this plant, which is quite interesting. I think the fact that it's kind of on the opposite end of the GIs in the Vietnam conflict, where you see almost the same thing, where soldiers are maybe not regularly using it, but in this scene, of course, they are his troop is regularly using it, but it's used in almost the exact same way that marijuana would be used by GIs. Continuing with the smaller or the lesser known drugs, other hard drugs were used in Vietnam. The same study that was discussing opiate use and heroin usage by veterans and or in-action soldiers talked about other hard drugs. They're used at least once by people, but less often than like a regular user. So if only, I believe, like marijuana was a very regularly used drug, but these ones not so much, and that includes LSD, cocaine, quaaludes, Darvon, pure opium, and not just opiates, mescaline and Valium. And so it's noticeably different. I think that people kind of, or at least maybe in pop culture, a lot of some of these drugs are referenced more, but it's kind of not the case. They weren't quote unquote hard addicts where they were, experimenting with multiple different drugs. It was only just a few.
Okay.
The last 2 drugs, which I kind of put in the same vein, it's almost like chewing tobacco, but tobacco was used smoked almost regularly. It's kind of something that, at least in previous eras, previous decades, seen as a drug, I would say. There's definitely the whole cultural shift from today.
Right, it's just a recreational item.
Yeah, and so, but it is interesting to see that in another author's book, Lile Hayslip, it's her book is called When Heaven and Earth Change Places. It's a personal account of her struggles, her life during the Vietnam War. And in the later portions of the book, she talks about how she used it in black marketeering. She would buy it and then eventually have to sell it to either the Americans or Republican forces. And that's how, not necessarily completely how she made her living, but it was at least one part of how she made her living was selling like Marlboros and other, I don't know what cigarette brands you would sell, but I don't even know if Marlboro was actually around back then. Probably. I kind of remember the Marlboro.
Was there sort of local growth of tobacco, or was it mostly just imports?
I don't know that question, unfortunately. I would say with the ones that they were selling back to Americans, it was imported. It would definitely be imported from the black marketing because it would be sold to GIs, and it wasn't. I think in her book she references, from what I remember, that the Vietnamese cigarettes were kind of like these dainty little ugly things that were kind of worthless but still usable, and that's not something a soldier would want.
Gotcha.
If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong on that point.
That makes sense. It also makes sense they would devote their time with the opium and the marijuana trade since it was larger.
In another document that I found, or an analysis of the war, the writer Chatterjee has had a recent take on the Vietnam War and drug exposure, and he says that the men in these platoons, aside from smoking cigarettes, concluded with like drinking alcohol and consuming tranquilizers and other addictive substances, and it's kind of referring back to that first point made, and it's because, or the earlier point that I made, that it's kind of to negotiate the trauma that's brought about the war. And so a lot of these things were just, I wouldn't say a social drug, but it was something that was used very recreationally.
Gotcha.
And then the last one that I found kind of interesting, which is the smaller known one, is the betel nut or the betel nut. I'm not sure on the exact pronunciation, but it's a very cultural and social drug in Southeast Asia. It's a psychoactive substance, and it was actually discovered, from my research, archaeologists have discovered that teeth of Iron Age skeletons, the molars were actually found to have the same chemical substance that is extracted when you chew on these nuts, or these betel nuts. I'm not sure if they're a fruit or not. I want to say that they're like a seed.
All right.
But yeah, it's very long preserved in the culture. I believe Hayslip also refers to the betel nut, and there's sort of a little chant to give up chewing betel nut, almost like chewing tobacco, I guess. And then the last one I'm going to talk about, which is definitely a more well-known substance, but alcohol. 1 in 4 veterans reported heavy symptomatic drinking before Vietnam, but after a while, this proportion kind of falls a little bit to 1 in 6. And so it's a very, out of all of them, that's probably the strangest one. I would expect, at least from the data that I looked up, looking at Lee Robbins' work, that I would expect there to be more alcohol abuse.
Well, would it be possible that they replaced it with some other use of drug?
Probably argue it. I know that in Lee Robbins's, I guess, not abstract, but his conclusion, that it probably wouldn't have been heroin. If they were to switch over to anything, it'd probably be less likely to be heroin. He cites that heavy drinkers were less likely to use heroin, and then heroin users tend to be light drinkers.
Okay.
So that's actually a good question to look into further. There might be a different connection when you look at other drugs, such as maybe the cigarettes or just marijuana in specific. But at least from what I know, heroin wasn't really the one that switched out, I guess. There wasn't a change of hand when it
Gotcha.
came to alcohol abuse and heroin abuse. And so, my last point is I wanted to talk about figures during and after the war. So, what were the, I guess, outcome? Like, what are the effects? Is there an increase in drug usage after the war? Is there a decrease? And what I found is that one of the documents that I found was during the war, at least, there was actually some alcohol rehab programs initiated, and so the listed numbers from whoever wrote this document, and I'm guessing it's a military document because it was declassified. Navy had over 1,600 personnel treated
Wow.
at the point that this document was created. The Air Force had several hundred. It's kind of not a specific number. A lot of this documentation has a lot of question marks around it because it's not precise answers.
Right.
They even note that all sources were incomplete and therefore the above information is only approximate. But the whole idea is to give some kind of trend. Air Force is only giving 120, and then the Army was given the number of 0/a few. Some of them go from 1969 all the way up until 1972. A lot of this is still post-het. It's looking through at least some of the or two of the archives. It was very difficult to find anything before 1968. I think I found maybe one or two, and they didn't really fit into exactly what I was talking about. Half of it was just programs similar to the marijuana or the policy of destroying marijuana fields.
Gotcha. Well, like you said, they were military documents perhaps because they were declassified, right? Maybe that's why they were declassified, didn't offer too many specifics.
Later in the war, you get a lot more information about drug usage, and there's kind of more, not representation, but there's more of a need by the military to push some kind of control or suppression of drug usage. But one of the documents that I found, which is from the National Center for Biotechnology Information, talked about how 1/5 of enlisted troops were addicted at some time during their tour, and it's not that same number that I was discussing earlier, like Steinbeck, where he says 75% of troops were high. And it's noted also that these drugs are kind of, in essence, switched out from previous wars, I guess. So what they were trying to describe was the fact that in earlier wars, alcohol was a very big substance that people used. World War II, World War One, and in essence, it was switched out to various different drugs. And it's only kind of indicated after the war, as what you see is that there's less than honorable discharges due to drug abuse, which affects or being able to get a job when you go back into civilian life. But it's kind of
Right.
hard to list the long-term effects of this drug usage. And so when we talk about the post-war drug usage, I think the bigger ones that come out on top is definitely going to be alcohol consumption, at least the biggest one that I've seen in my research. Another publication by the NCBI states that there was at least a drinking problem when they looked at data from 1977, 1983, and 1985. And they conducted this study in which what they found was that a greater portion of Vietnam era veterans were heavy drinkers and a smaller portion were abstainers. These veterans, this was determined on race, that both race kind of had increased proportion, but it kind of went into crime as well. One of the specific ones that the report is that alcohol-related motor vehicle crashes or violations increased, or were reported in a significantly greater proportion than to those that were non-veterans. And so I would definitely say, when you're looking at Vietnam veterans, that there was an alcohol problem coming back, and dealing with those same struggles that I was talking about before, whether it's your economic status or your education status and not being able to find a job, which inherently affects your economic status, or dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. In looking at other drugs, such as heroin, post-Vietnam narcotic use is actually kind of unique, I would say. And so when we start looking at other drugs or other categories like narcotics, you kind of see a similar story, not exactly the same. In another study done in 1971 of those who had already finished their original deployment, they were asked if they quit all narcotics after previous use narcotics without any kind of addiction or self-noted addiction, and that if they felt they were addicted. 65 out of 90 said that they quit all narcotics. 33 out of 90 noted that they use narcotics but they don't have an addiction, and then 2 out of 90 said that they did it, or that they were addicted. Now, at the same time of this questioning, there was a urine test, I believe, done. It was definitely a drug test. In this sample size, you have 341, and the ones 61 out of 341 were actually drug positive.
So the testimony was
a little skewed. Like I said, these were all self-noted that they weren't addicts, or they weren't using, or they completely went cold turkey on narcotics. Using without addiction, 32 were detected as positive, and then those addicted who claimed themselves as addicted, 7 of them were detected as positive.
All right.
And so it's definitely, there is a lot of increased drug usage after the war, and it's the same reason, like I said, with alcohol. You don't see those strange drugs that I was talking about that are lesser known. You don't see betel nut talked about in the States. You don't hear rosa canina in the States. It's, in a way, there's a difference in how GIs and the North Vietnamese, or even the South Vietnamese, dealt with the stress of combat or living in the Vietnam War. But at the same time, there's a lot of similarities. So I just want to conclude that my research here isn't complete. It's not finite or infinite. I probably made a few mistakes on the way, and if anybody corrects them, that's makes me perfectly happy. You could always continue to find new viewpoints and new perspectives and new data. Hopefully more information comes out about the North Vietnamese and their drug usage, because I'm gonna be honest, it was kind of sparse. But do you have any questions, Jose?
Not really. Just for, I guess, food for thought. I'd be really interested to see, sort of, learn more about Vietnamese culture, because it sounds like a lot of those, well, I won't say a lot, but a majority of them were used in Vietnam before conflict began, and maybe conflict just exacerbated their abuse.
Yeah, so there was definitely some, like opium was definitely kind of imposed on the culture and on Vietnamese society, just as the French imposed themselves on the Vietnamese. But yeah, you're right, there's, the betel nut and the rosa canina are kind of two different ones where there's a lot of differences, I think, that you can obtain from their usage. as compared to the GIs. But there's, like I said, a lot of similarities, at least with Rosa Canina and how cannabis is used. It's used almost in the same way and for the same reasons.
Right.
But
I guess one could just say that the GIs, they understood or recognized certain types of drugs and were able to instantly or have access, use those instead of the other ones.
yeah, yeah, definitely access had a lot to do with it. You know, I'm guessing that because it was available around them and because it was free, it was something that was naturally occurring. Um, Whereas American GIs were able to pay for either marijuana or opiates on on very cheap levels.
Right.
So, like I said, so no more questions, Jose.
Not that I can think of. It was quite an interesting topic. Just wish I knew a little bit more about it. Might might get into it now.
Well, thank you again, Jose. Like I said before, Jose has been a gracious friend, and I hope everything goes well for you. Thank you for being on the podcast. Hopefully, there will be some more iterations of this style, this format.
Well, thank you for having me, buddy, and it was a pleasure being here.
All right. Well, thank you very much.